Okay. Welcome, folks, to week 6. This is our last week of the workshop, but hopefully this isn't our last time together. For today's last session, we have our guest speaker, Valerie Leonard, who we got to know a little bit in the beginning. Before I pass it over to her, I'm just going to recap last week, and then I'm going to pick it up again at the end, wrapping up the workshop and letting folks know next steps. So last week I wasn't here, but we had Goody and some of the UIC folks lead us on a wonderful session. You all talked about evaluation, and I saw you all had a couple of exercises. But if you missed it like I did, the recording is now on Google Site along with the slides from last week. So thank you to folks who came to last week's session, and thank you for all of your participation. Okay, and then I think that's where I stopped talking. I'm gonna pass it off to let our guest speaker for today introduce herself, and then she's gonna lead us through a session on sustainability. So I'm gonna pass it over to you, Valerie.
Okay, sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's an honor to be here before you. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. We're the ideal community for nonprofit leaders, and I'm not going to talk too much about myself. There are a couple slides about me, and I promise you I'm not narcissistic, so the slideshow is really not about me. It's about collaboration. We're going to be focusing on collaboration, and what I'm going to share with you are ideas you can use before, during, and after your design development process. In an ideal situation, you will go through these steps before you actually submit a proposal and start implementation. But if you're like most people, you're not living in an ideal world. You respond to opportunities as they come, and opportunities don't necessarily allow us to live this perfect linear life and, just execute things systematically. But ideally, if you had the time, these are some of the things that you would do. A little bit about Nonprofit Utopia. Again, we're the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. We have an online community where folks can share ideas in a safe space. We also provide consulting, online courses. We got an online store as well where we share, materials that you can use in your day-to-day journey. And we, also share leadership development as well. We're part of the Maxwell team for leadership. And our mission is to develop the next generation of ethical nonprofit leaders, emphasis on ethical. We want to make sure, too, that we bridge the gap between folks, in my age bracket. I'm on the tail end of the baby boom, right? And then, younger people, make sure that we transfer the knowledge that we have and also learn some of the technical skills that younger folks have. And our vision is to train up to 50,000 people around the world between now and 2033. A little bit about myself. I'm adjunct professor at UIC in the Nonprofit Certificate program. I will be teaching a course in nonprofit operations. I do also podcasts as well as some live streams, and I'm also on staff from time to time at Roosevelt, teaching courses in social enterprise. So I thought a good model to talk about would be collective impact. What I like about the collective impact model is typically it's used with the interdisciplinary group. It's used in situations where you're trying to solve a problem that's complex, right? And you're usually focusing on a specific geography. Now, you don't necessarily need to have, this large scale project in order to use it. The principles of collaboration, I think are pretty consistent, but, I pretty much, I like to use this model because if you can get this discipline at a smaller scale, by the time you're getting to a point where you're trying to solve for large, complex problems in your community, your city, your state, it'll be a piece of cake, right? So, by definition, it's a commitment of a group of important actors. So you've got people from the community who are seen as leaders in their particular area. So people who might be leaders in housing, people who might be leaders in healthcare, social services, or whatever, they're laser focused on a problem in a specific geography, and they realize that in order to solve the problem, it's going to take all hands on deck. The problem might be bigger than, say our teachers, if it's a problem with school dropouts, right? That it's going to take more than the schools to solve it. There are going to be a number of other actors who will need to come into play and share resources and figure out, the supports that the schools and the students and their parents would need to prevent school dropout. So after you look at, what the problem is, right? You would ideally want people who are part of the group to come together with a common agenda. So there's a mutual agreement of what the problem is, right? As well as a mutual agreement as to how to address it. So that usually comes with significant planning. And again, you can utilize these same concepts, whether you're focusing on a large community problem or, a problem that your single organization is trying to address, using, players from, different departments. Again, these principles of collaboration are pretty transferable, from one area to another. And then after that, you come up with an agreed way to measure outcomes. So ideally, you're looking at, you're going to have some goals and objectives, but then, how do you measure your success, right? So people around the table will come up with ways to measure progress toward that success. And again, these are measurements that are mutually agreed upon by everyone. And then in an ideal world, you would put together a system where you can, track your outcomes and your progress, and then ways that people are actually contributing to, the success. And then after that, you do mutually reinforcing activities. And so basically that's, developing an action plan to address, whatever the issues are you had. So think of strategies that you will have in order to address the problems. And then there's backbone support. So that's going to be a lead agency that's going to be providing the administrative support. They'll be responsible for coordinating marketing messages and, advancing the agenda. However, just because you're the lead agency does not by any means mean that you are controlling the process, right? That, the other stakeholders who are at the table don't have a voice. They don't have equal voice in what happens, right? But as the backbone agency, you are going to be responsible for the coordination. And, if there's a grant, you will probably be the one to whom the grant is given. You will also be responsible, to maintain, fiscal reports and all of that good stuff. But again, everybody who is around the table is going to have a role in making sure that the initiative is successful. And then there's continuous communication. So you're going to need to communicate internally, make sure all the players that you're working with know what's going on. They know the status of the project, right? And there's going to be back and forth communication. They need to know when the meetings are, and each player needs to report out. So there's some mutual accountability from the partners as to, who did what. This is what we committed to. And just as important, and sometimes, in some cases more important, you need to make sure that people in the community are, well informed of what you're going on. One, you need to make sure that you get their support, but two, you never know who in the community might be able to help you advance your cause. So you're going to have to, constantly share press releases, flyers, phone calls, robocalls in the community, newspaper ads, appearing on live streams, talk shows, all of this stuff to keep people engaged in solving the problem, right? So as with any program, right, any strategic plan, you're going to start off with a goal, right? And I'm sure over the course of these past few weeks, you have learned what goals are. And, basically they're a sweeping statement of what you want to happen as a direct result of your intervention, right? And our goals sometimes can be just stated as a plain goal, and then sometimes we have SMART goals. But in this case, an example is we want to make XYZ medical device the preferred device of podiatric physicians in diagnosing and treating foot conditions. So it doesn't tell you when it's going to happen, but, just overall, this is what, the physicians thought that they would want to happen. A SMART goal, on the other hand, is specific, is measurable, it's achievable, it's realistic and timely. So basically the difference is, there's a deadline, right? And the goal is also going to be developed within the context of the capacity of the individuals around the table. So a SMART goal to address hunger for a grassroots organization that's just starting up is going to look a whole lot differently than a SMART goal from, say, the Chicago Food Depository, who's been around for ages, tapping into the same problems. So when we talk about specific, we're talking about what it is you want to do. When we talk about measurable, you have some idea of what data you can use to make sure that you're actually advancing toward that goal. And again, achievable, is it within your power? Is it within your capacity, your skill level, the financial resources that you have? Is it realistic, given, all the tools at your disposal or your lack thereof, within the context, again, of what you're able to do. And then what's the deadline? When are you going to achieve it? And that helps you to maintain your focus. And an example of a SMART goal is, by January 15, 2018, I want to have developed and tested, and that means have friends and family sample and give a rating on a 1 to 10 scale, 5 sample items for the menu. And this is a goal within the context of a restaurant owner, who wants to make sure that whatever he puts on his menu, is well received. All right, so the outcomes are the changes that we want to see as a direct result of our activities. And it's important that these are changes that we can pinpoint to, specifically to our activities. So often I have seen organizations say, as an outcome, we want to reduce crime in the community, but they only have the capacity to touch, say, 25 people at a time. But they measure themselves by what's going on outside of their sphere of control, right? So you want to make sure that when you develop outcomes, these are impacting the very people and only the people, right, that you can reach through your intervention. So what's going to change for them as a direct result of what you're doing or what you're proposing to do? The only time your organization is the subject to the outcomes is when you're doing some internal capacity building project where you're trying to strengthen your system, strengthen your programs and that good stuff. But as a rule of thumb, the outcomes are for the people that you want to help. And then metrics, and that's just a fancy way of saying how are we going to measure our progress toward our goals, toward our objectives, and toward our outcomes, right? So those metrics are going to vary. And even if you're working with an interdisciplinary group, meaning, you might have some people who are specialists in housing, some who are specialists in healthcare, some who are specialists in education, the group should still, together come up with a set of outcome measurements and benchmarks that each subsector of your group is going to be responsible for. And, that helps you move the project along in a coordinated way, even though you're working across different sectors. It also helps you, keep the project on task, right, on budget. And, it's also important too, once you develop all of these goals and objectives, you identify the resources and how much it's going to cost and all that good stuff. All right, so SMART objectives. And think of objectives, and I'm sure you've heard this over the course of the time you've been together. Objectives are basically a way of achieving your strategies and your goals, right? And usually, even if you don't have an overall SMART goal, your objectives are usually SMART. You're going to make sure that you can align your activities with your goals and strategies. So in this example, the physicians said that they're going to increase the awareness and or use of XYZ's podiatric device by 20%. They're going to deliver a 20% year-over-year increase in sales of the device between 2016 and 2017. And they're going to decrease the number of device malfunction incidences by 10% in 2016. So notice they're telling you, what they're going to do. They're going to tell you about the magnitude of change that's going to occur. And then it's going to also give you a deadline. And we're assuming that whatever they're sharing is going to be within their own capacity, right? Strategic alliances. So your strategic alliances are informal partnerships. And, they could be groups of individuals, groups of organizations that have come together to establish a new program or project. And typically, the decision-making, right, or the governance structure is going to include things like informal ground rules, handbooks, and or a memorandum of understanding. And just notice that even though you have all of these systems in place, none of these is legally binding. However, they do represent, hopefully, a meeting of the minds of how people are going to operate within that alliance. So here is a sample collaborative structure, regardless of whether your collaboration is informal, one or two people, whether it's a formal partnership, whether it's a joint venture with two organizations that have come together that are creating a legal entity, or whether it's a corporation the basic elements of a collaborative structure are outlined here. You're going to start off with some sort of governance structure or decision-making structure, right? So your collaboration, depending on how informal or formal it is going to be governed by an MOU, memorandum of understanding, a partnership agreement, a joint venture agreement, some sort of consortium agreement, or even, the corporation's bylaws, right? So everything, you always start off with governance, the rules of how things are going to operate, how they're going to be structured. And then every collaboration, regardless of the form it takes, is going to have a program component, it's going to have an administrative component, it's going to have a marketing component, and fundraising component. So this example, is done in the context of a group of organizations that have come together to administer a Second Chance Act program. And some of you may or may not be familiar with the Second Chance Act, but that's a act that was put into place by the Bush administration to look at ways that ex-offenders or even offenders can transition successfully from prison to their communities, and making sure they have all the supports in place, and then also making sure that the problems were addressed by multiple stakeholders, right? So there's a whole continuum of services. So one way to do this is, you have this group of organizations that do different things like housing, providing social services like behavioral health, educational services like GED, etc. So under the program function, we might have case management. Organization A is doing that. So they're assessing people, making sure that they have everything that they need, but they realize too that they can't do everything themselves. So they kind of farm out different responsibilities to different organizations. There's a mentoring piece. There's also housing, and notice these are done by different organizations. There's job training, and all of these are elements that have been shown, they have evidence to show that this combination of interventions work together to reduce recidivism. So they got evidence-based programming. The programming isn't done by one agency, but by several. And then you have another agency that's responsible for finance and administration, and they're also managing the grant. And then marketing and outreach, everyone who's part of it is responsible for it, but it's going to be coordinated by the lead agency. And then the lead agency is also going to do fundraising. All right. So here is an example, and if your eyes are like mine, I know you can't read this, but I'll explain what's going on, and I'll also make it a little larger. This is an actual program logic model that I did for After School Matters. After School Matters was looking to work with LISC and their partners in the communities, the New Communities program, to not only put together fitness and nutrition program, but also to do another program in truancy prevention. So since you guys are focusing more on health, we'll focus on the health example. So they were looking at ways that their organizations within 17 communities around the city could actually come together, right? So I recommended that the first thing they do is develop a program logic model, right? A program logic model, can take on many forms, but typically they all have these things in common. They typically all have inputs, which is, the resources. They have outputs, which are the activities, and the outcomes and impacts. What do you expect to happen as a direct result of what you're doing? And my favorite model, this model is based on the University of Wisconsin model. They have a whole website just laced with program logic models and resources that you can use. But I suggested that they start off with a logic model so that way people can develop a common agenda. Remember, we talked about collective impact. So you want to take the information that you've gained from looking at what's going on in the community, right? You want to do a situation analysis. Sometimes you might want to do a full-blown assessment of the community needs. But here we, talked about, what's going on in the community. And for example, in 2004, 19% of American children were overweight versus 21% for the state of Illinois and 26% for the city of Chicago. Now, I'm not going to read all of this because you will have access to these slides and you can read for yourself. But basically, that section is basically summarizing, what the problem is, what's going on. And based on what the problem is, then we develop overall goals, right? So those goals we developed were, one, to utilize after-school programming to support Chicago Public Schools' efforts to, one, improve student performance, encourage healthy lifestyles among after-school matters and new communities, program communities, and then also to reduce the occurrence of adolescents' obesity in after-school matters and new communities, NCP. All right, so notice those goals are all in the interest of the parties. So after school matters, they work very closely with CPS. So they want to make sure that since they're going to operate in the schools, that whatever the goals are going to positively impact the schools. You want to create win-win situations for all of the partners. All right, so on the education perspective and health and wellness. All right, so the inputs in the University of Wisconsin model, you look at things that we invest. So the things that we invest are things that we already have. So that could be staff, students, partners, existing program models, time, money, materials, and then what we acquire, those are things that we don't have on hand, but we need to actually implement the program. The next thing we do is look at outputs. So those are the activities and who we reach. So what are we going to do in order to reach those goals and objectives? So we already told you what the resources are that we need to do it. So the activities we're going to engage in are developing program models that can be replicated throughout, the communities for after school matters and NCP. And those will be done, with the schools. We're going to provide technical assistance and grant opportunities to community partners. And again, I'm not going to read everything in the interest of time. You'll have this to take home with you. And then our target, who is it that we're reaching? We want to reach youth. We want to, because they're the ones who are directly impacted, but their parents are a stakeholder, right? So we want to reach them, to share strategies with them so that they can reinforce what we're trying to do with the kids, which in this case, increase healthy lifestyles. We want to also target community stakeholders, particularly those who could help us. And you also might consider targeting community stakeholders who can hurt you, right? So you might have to tailor your activities and your messages based on who your various targets are. And then next we want to look at, the outcomes and the impact. What's going to happen as a direct result of what we're doing? So you might want to divide that in terms of short term, what's going to happen short term, and what's going to happen on the long term, right? So in the short term, they expected to see improved ability for students to focus on their studies because, you know, the studies have shown there's a direct relationship between fitness and nutrition and outcomes, academic outcomes, right? And again, I'm not going to read everything. And then ultimately, in those communities, you want to see improvement in student performance. The rate of adolescent obesity is going to be lower than the national averages. And then students and their families are going to internalize a culture of health, fitness, and nutrition. So you can see this will be a very long-term project because these changes don't happen overnight. So practically, what does that look like, you know, when we're actually trying to work together, right? For this particular initiative, you know, we looked at all the things that they were trying to do, and we identified some core key functions, research, policy, and advocacy being one, programs being another, obviously administration being another, marketing and community outreach, and capacity building for, you know, for this particular group. So what we did was we looked at each one of the partners and what they could contribute under each of these different categories. And under research, policy, and advocacy, after school matters, they would do policy, advocacy, and research. CLOC would do research on fitness, nutrition, and policy implications. You know, they focused on childhood obesity. And then Chicago Public Schools could provide advocacy and access to internal data, right? You know, making sure that they kept confidentiality as well. And then for the programs, After School Matters, you know, they were already doing programs, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel. But what is it they could contribute to this process doing what they already do? So they had clubs, pre-apprenticeship programs, you know, sports, culinary, arts, and health careers, you know, and then they also had access to Science 37. They had Neighbor Sports and Sports 7. All right. And then LISC, they already had programs as well. They had b-ball on the block, boxing, skateboarding, soccer, blah, blah, blah. And then since After School Matters would be the lead agency, they will be responsible for personnel, finance, managing the contract, and providing facilities and supplies. All the partners would be responsible for marketing and community outreach. So for example, After School Matters would provide access to over 450 program managers, schools and parks, and community organizations in their network. LISC had access to 14 NCP directors in 17 communities that, you know, they could reach out to engage. And then the new communities program participants, so these are organizations on the ground, they had access to over 1,000 community organizations and churches. And then CPS, they had access to over 400,000 students at the time, right? In over 400 schools at the time. So basically, each partner was asked to tap into their networks to promote the programming. And then under capacity building, After School Matters would provide fundraising and resource development as well as evaluation. LISC would provide funding and resource development and access to World Sports Chicago, and then a fund to help poor areas for Chicago 2016 legacy. So you can see this is an old example, but then CLOC, they would provide their turnkey training programs in fitness and nutrition, as well as evaluation of those programs. And then how does that look from an implementation schedule? You know, typically before you even do something like this, and even if you want to do a diagram, typically what you would do is you would list the tasks that are involved, indicate who's responsible, and then do a deadline. The way this graph or this graphic works, we are saying that the implementation is going to be done in 3 phases. All right. And then it's going to also be done over 3 years. So in year 1, all right, which will encompass phase 1 and some of phase 2, right? We're looking to develop more intentional and informal collaborations and networking amongst all of these partners. So the first quarter, After School Matters and New Communities Programs directors, they're going to attend LISC NCP quarterly events, and then also the After School Matters proposal TA sessions. So they're really at this point kind of doing the outreach and planning, talking to one another. They're also going to engage their respective directors in the development of program concepts. So all of this is happening quarter 1 in year 1. Quarter 3 in year 1, they're going to develop a referral network. And then they're also going to, under phase 2 in quarter 4, they're going to recruit partners to address gaps in services. And then also in year 2, phase 1, you notice these phases kind of overlap in terms of years. They're going to, again, phase 1, develop more intentional, informal collaboration. So they're going to publish a resource guide for nutrition and fitness programs. And then they're going to finalize their collaboration structure. And that actually happens in phase 3. And this is optional to roll out new fitness and nutrition programs that are not existing at the moment, looking at ways that they can actually come together and formalize their collaboration. And then they'll also begin fundraising, and then they'll develop the infrastructure for that program in year 3. They'll locate a facility and hire staff, and then begin to implement the program. All right, and if you have any questions, just post them in chat and I'll look at them afterwards. And then a way to make sure that you maintain accountability is to develop a memorandum of understanding. Now, in many cases, it's been my observation that our MOUs are, they focus very high level on the roles and responsibilities and may not necessarily go as deeply as they could go, right? So I'm going to share with you some ways that the MOU can go a little bit deeper. And basically, MOU is basically a meeting of the minds, right? This is what each party understands is, what we're trying to achieve. So you're kind of outlining the project and goals and objectives, blah, 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 and indicating roles and responsibilities. And the good thing about an MOU is not legally binding, so you don't necessarily have to use all of this legalese, right? And you, and even though it's not legally binding, it does help people to remember what the agreement is. If you want to have something legally binding, I'm sorry about that, you would actually need to do a contract. And the difference between a contract and an MOU, a contract obviously is legally binding, right? And one of the things that make contracts legally binding versus an MOU is the fact that there is money changing hands, right? So that's one of the big differentiators, right? So you can also include indemnification provisions. And basically what indemnification provisions do is tell you, in the event of a loss, you do something that causes a loss, you're going to make the folks whole, right? So that's another good thing about a contract. Now your MOU can also, if you think about it, can also include language as to, what happens in the event that, there's no performance. So here's some things to consider when you draft your MOU. You want to talk about your background and situation. You wanted to include the purpose for the collaboration, talk about the mission and vision. And here's one thing that people often miss, which are core values. And your core values can really throw a monkey wrench in the things when you get to a point where there's conflicts and people are looking at things from a different lens. So you really need to come to an agreement as to what the core values of this collaboration, and even more important than listing the core values, things like integrity, honesty, transparency, blah, blah, blah. You can't just put down a bunch of wonderful sounding words. You have to actually live this stuff, right? And, so you want to constantly measure your activities through the lens of your mission, vision, and core values. And then you want to talk about the project. So you want to include the project description, goals, objectives, outcomes, and benchmarks, project evaluation, project term, start and end date. You want to talk about the team, who's on the team, what people, what organizations, talk about the governance structure, how you're going to make decisions. You want to talk about the lead agency and their responsibilities. You want to talk about the fiscal agent and their responsibilities. And word of advice, unless your grant agreement says so, I would try to make sure that the lead agency is different from the fiscal agent, to make sure that, you're spreading the power, so to speak. You don't want to have one of the groups just consolidate all of their power and marginalize other members. And you want to also outline the roles and responsibilities. And, most people kind of stop at roles and responsibilities, but you really want to outline what the deliverables are. What are you producing, right? What are you committed to producing? What are the outcomes for each team member? So you want to make sure that there's accountability for everybody to pull their weight. And then when we look at project management, we're looking at the project deliverables and products. You're looking at the actual process of project management, and project management just means coordinating resources, financial resources, human resources, making sure that you adhere to certain timelines and you're actually hitting your numbers. And then, you have to decide how are you going to track that and how are you going to report progress. And then, this is something I almost never, ever see in MOUs, but it probably should be, policy considerations. What's going to happen with the intellectual property that's created within this group? And that's really, really important if you're not creating a new entity, that has the ability to own the intellectual property. Usually when you work in collaboration, this is a bunch of individuals or a bunch of organizations. You're not creating a new entity. So it's going to be really important to have those conversations about what happens when you create something new, a new brochure, a new website. Who owns that? You need to think in advance what happens in the event that conflict arises. And whenever you have more than one person in a room, you're going to have conflict at some point. So you need to think ahead of time how that's going to be resolved. So when it happens, you're not making people feel like they're being singled out. You want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how that's going to permeate the whole process. You talk about accessibility to people, who are marginalized, accessibility for people who have physical disabilities. Talk about document retention policies, conflict of interest policies. Even though you're not necessarily creating a new entity, it's still important to talk about conflicts of interest. Risk management and insurance, compliance with regulators and funders. And then, when you start, think about getting out of it, right? And you want to do this before any conflict arises or before you get to a point where you figure, this isn't working, right? So exit strategies, what's going to constitute a dissolution or, dissolving this whole collaboration. Think about that first, right? In the event that members are not living up to their responsibilities, how do you get rid of them? Or in the event people might have to move, how do you replace them? Are people members as individuals, or are they members, or is their organization a member? What are the circumstances that people leave, and how do you replace them? What are the triggers and the procedures? And then think about how you bring on new members, the same way. How do you, what are the criteria? What are the, how do you vet people? How do you recruit them? And then think about how the work actually gets done. So, think about, and this is going to vary from time to time. And not only do you want to create a workflow diagram, but you actually want to kind of explain it, in a narrative, right? So, so everybody is clear on what happens and when, and it also helps you to identify any redundancy in your project. And then you think about the financial considerations, right? And you want to create financial considerations that are equitable. All too often we have large institutions, large organizations partnering with smaller organizations and even individuals, but the financial benefits usually accrue, to that lead agency. So how do you figure out ways that everybody can benefit financially? And then, look at the overall cost. And then how are you going to compensate, each partner, whether it be through cash, through some sort of increased knowledge. But, that needs to be written out. And again, hopefully you can spread the financial wealth around too. And then finally, sealing the deal. You need to have people who are authorized by their organizations to actually encumber the organization, right, to this agreement. You don't want people to just sign on without approval from their board or approval from, the person that they report to. And usually you want to have the board president from the organization, and at a minimum, the executive director, because you want to make sure that there's full buy-in from each organization. And in the event that there's some big liability that occurs, you don't want to create a situation where organizations' head said, well, I knew nothing about this, right? I'm not culpable. So that stuff is really important. And some of the attachments that you might want to include would be things like the program logic model. And that's important because it helps you not only during the planning process, it helps you during the implementation process. It can be used as a management tool, and it also helps you during the evaluation process. So there's consistency throughout all phases. So that's really critical, and you can use that to increase accountability. You want to have the project structure, the project workflow chart, the budget, the compensation for each partner, the implementation schedule, the tools that you're going to use to track, and then other documents that you think might be important. All right, so that's the presentation. Before I share the exercise, I want to see if there are any questions. All right, are there any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat. That doesn't mean there aren't any questions in the chat, but Reverend Smith, are you raising your hand? I can't hear you. You're on mute.
No, I was stretching my shoulder.
Oh, I saw the hand. Good one. All right. Are there any questions? No questions? Any comments? Anything people would like to share from their own experiences before I share the assignment? All righty. So in this case, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, Valerie, it's me, Maggie. I was just wondering what you think about taking a 5-minute break so all of us can maybe stretch and get some coffee or some water.
And unglaze your eyes. Yes, I think that's a great idea. How long are we here till 12?
We're here till 12, yeah.
Okay, all right. All right, so yeah, a break, maybe 10 minutes, you think? Can that work?
We could do 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think 10 minutes. Yeah, we're not breaking out into groups, but we will share out if possible.
Okay.
All right. Okay. All right.
All right, folks, see you back here at 11:10.
Per column. Yeah. Yeah. So there would be one cell per partner in this column. So if you're thinking about working with organization ABC, list that organization's name. And again, for our purposes, if you plan on reporting out and you don't feel comfortable listing that partner's name, you can just use a different name. Then you would indicate the programs and services that they offer. And then in the next box, you talk about how their services might complement your organization's services. And then in the next box, you want to look at potential areas for collaboration and what that might look like. So like a collaboration / structure. And then you might want to, at the end, indicate the pros and the cons for that collaboration. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes on this exercise, but given that we have a little bit more time, I wanted to share an alternative, but I don't see it. It's online. I do have a link to the box. Just bear with me. And yeah, the second alternative would be to critique an agreement. This is a standard agreement. It's a partnership agreement between the Promised Neighborhood and the community partner. So you may have heard of the Promised Neighborhood program, education program that was funded by the federal government. They required that people getting the funding have a MOU. So here is the standard MOU that was part of the proposal process. And if you prefer, you can review this for about 20 minutes and, see how, look at the pros and look at how it can be strengthened. And if there's anyone who's interested, I can share the link to this box folder where you can download it. All right. So before we focus on our exercises, are there any questions?
Hi, Valerie. Would you
Hi.
also be able to put that link in the chat as well?
Yeah, there it is. Does everyone see that? And does everyone have the collaborator? Okay, so you've got the collaborator analysis. Okay, great. All right, so we're gonna let's work on that for 20 minutes. So that gives us until what, 11:35, and then we'll come back and hopefully people can share their thoughts on one assignment or the other. All right. And I'm here if you have any questions. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I'm here in the event that you have any questions. You're welcome.